This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at time walk effects. In other words, we're looking at cards that give you extra turns. These effects are among the most powerful in the game, and they receive their name from the original card that did this, the absurdly powerful Time Walk, which is part of the Power 9, and give you an extra turn for only 2 mana. Taking extra turns is powerful because it allows you to continue on developing your board before your opponent gets another chance to. This makes it harder for your opponent to catch back up to you on their turn. In all, 34 cards that give you extra turns have been printed. In this video, we're going to look at the 10 that have made the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, while Grand Prix top 8s are worth 1 point. Now, let's talk about number 10. At number 10, we have Karn's Temporal Sundering, which comes with the legendary sorcery type, which requires you to control a legendary creature or a planeswalker to cast it. But boy, does it pay you back for achieving that setup. It not only gives you an extra turn, it also lets you bounce something. That's a pretty good deal for 6 mana in this day and age, even if it doesn't come close to the power of the original Time Walk. It has one Pro Tour top 8 so far in a Turbo Fog deck from Pro Tour 25th. With Turbo Fog decks continuing to be a thing in this standard format, there's a chance it could see a little more play, but the setup cost here is just too much for it to find its way into future Tier 1 versions of the deck. At number 9, we have Part the Water Veil. 6 mana for a Time Walk is a bit much. It is 3 times more than the original, right? And that's true, but you can also cast this as a 9 mana 4/4 with haste that gives you an extra turn, which is a pretty nice use of 9 mana if you're going to do something with 9 mana. This does what most Time Walks don't really do. It can give you a win condition all on its own. Decks that can produce that type of mana played it in Standard, where it managed one Grand Prix top 8 in 2015 in a ramp deck. It has also seen play in the time walkiest of all decks, arguably in any format, the Walks deck in Modern that is just jam full of cards that give you extra turns, including, obviously enough, others that made this list. It looks to chain them all together and use that 4/4 land creature to beat the opponent to death thanks to all those turns. At number 8, we have Seed Time, which is a green Time Walk. I mean, okay, it is a super narrow one, but a green Time Walk nonetheless. If your opponent plays an annoying blue spell during your turn, like a counter spell or a card draw spell, you get to spend the same amount of mana as the original Time Walk, only 2, and you get an extra turn. That's a pretty great way to hate on blue decks, since generally when you take that extra turn, they're probably tapped out from whatever blue spell that they did cast during your turn. As you might imagine, this put up all of its points as a sideboard card. It was especially effective against Psychotog control decks, which were dominating Standard in 2002. It has one Grand Prix top 8 and Extended as well from 2007, which was another Psychotog-heavy metagame. At number 7, it's Time Warp. So far, the Time Walk effects we have looked at have done something different in one way or another than the original Time Walk. That's not the case, though, with Time Warp. It is literally just a Time Walk that costs 5 mana, which shows you how big of a mistake it was to print the original Time Walk at only 2 mana, since this card was still good enough to see play. In Extended, it managed one Grand Prix top 8 in 2003, in what, as far as I can tell, was the first successful Turbo Fog deck ever. Like Part the Water Veil, it also sees play in the Modern Turns deck. At number 6, we have Temporal Mastery, which comes with the Miracle mechanic, which means if you can draw it as your first card in a turn, it costs the exact same as the original Time Walk and does the same exact thing, which is pretty awesome. It first found its success in Block, in a deck built around manipulating the top of your library so that you could cast a bunch of miracles for their miracle cost. Like Time Warp and Part the Water Veil, it also has 2 top 8s in Modern Turns decks as well. At number 5, we have the card that sort of inspired me to want to look at Time Walks, and that's Nexus of Fate, which was just recently banned in Magic Arena's Best of 1 standard format. This card made a lot of people lose their minds when Wizards had it announced as a buy-a-box promo, meaning that you could not get it from a booster pack and only by buying a box, as the name would imply. Some in the community immediately felt that this thing would be powerful enough to find a deck, and that the fact that it was a buy-a-box promo was just wrong. It is an instant speed Time Walk effect, something we don't really see much of, and it shuffles back into your library, and that makes it possible to loop your turns forever. After the Nexus was printed, Turbo Fog decks emerged that sought to survive long enough to start casting Nexi, and then win the game with a Torrential Gearhulk or a Teferi. These decks are where Nexus of Fate has all of its points. It quickly proved problematic for Best of 1 in Arena, where people decide to just chain them together forever until an opponent's scooped. Just ask Shahar Shenhar about that. The Nexus looks to be a legit part of the standard metagame right now, but there is some chance that it gets banned in traditional standard too. We'll just have to see. At number 4, we have a red Time Walk. We already had a green one, and now we're looking at Final Fortune, a red Time Walk. Sure, it comes with some very real downsides since you lose the game after that extra turn, but it is also another instant speed version of a Time Walk effect. What's more is, the decks that ran this would usually win the game after they cast it thanks to the extra turn. Unlike most of the cards on this list, this is a Time Walk that aggro decks really wanted. Aggro decks often find themselves one turn away from being able to kill their opponent, only to have them stabilize. This makes sure they can't do that. If you look at the board and you have lethal next turn, well, why not make next turn right now? In a way, this could double the damage your creatures do in a turn, a good way for any aggro deck to end a game. It found success in the early days of the Magic Pro Tour, especially in 1997 and 1998, where it was featured predominantly in red aggro decks. In 1997, it had 2 top 8s at a Block Pro Tour, and in 1998, it managed 3 top 8s at Worlds in the standard format. Sly decks, essentially early versions of what we call red deck wins now, were where it saw play then. After those early successes, it didn't see play for a while, though it has managed 1 top 8 at an extended Grand Prix in 2005. It doesn't seem likely that it's going to see play in any other formats anytime soon. At number 3, we have an artifact that can give you extra turns, and that's Time Vault, which is a card with a very weird history. This weird history is something I've spoken about before, back when I made videos on the history of the ban and restricted list for the Ether Hub, a series I want to continue at some point here on my channel as soon as I can find the time. But the Cliff's Notes of Time Vault is that it got banned in March 1994, ahead of the first Worlds tournament, and it was one of the earliest cards in the game to get banned. It was way too good at giving you extra turns. Sure, it could make you skip your turn, but you could untap it with cards like Twiddle, and this would allow you to sort of cheat your way into getting more than 1 extra turn and never have to skip your turn. Then, in 1996, Wizards did something pretty creative, something I don't think they have done ever again. They drastically changed the text of the card so that it wouldn't be quite as broken. They changed it so that it had to have a time counter on it that would be removed when you tapped it to take the extra turn. This meant that if you untapped it with an effect like Twiddle, it didn't matter now because it no longer had its time counter. It had another activated ability that allowed you to untap it and put a time counter on it, provided you skipped your next turn. Wizards then unbanned the card, but kept it on the restricted list just to be safe. It didn't see any play in its newly powered down version. Then, in 2005, someone realized that you could technically use that activated ability of skipping your next turn as many times as you wanted during your turn. This meant that you could combine it with any cost that allowed you to tap it for an effect and get that effect infinite times, because you could just untap your Time Vault as many times as you wanted. With a card like Flame Fusillade, this meant you could do infinite damage. The whole extra turn part of the card was irrelevant, and people actively found a way to abuse the errata text that Wizards had used to nerf the card in the first place. Wizards, probably feeling defeated, restored the card to its old time counterless version because they decided the ability to tap and untap this infinite times would cause more problems than finding ways to untap it with other cards. In general, it seems like Wizards figured out that errata-ing cards to change what they do was problematic, because they've never done it again in any real way, except when a mistake occurs in the text of a card and they sort of correct it before that card is actually printed. After they restored it to how it worked originally, it started to see play again, and it still does see play in Vintage as a card on the restricted list. It sees a wide variety of play there, including in artifact-heavy decks and storm decks. It's going to continue to see play in Vintage since it has such a powerful effect to give you an extra turn. At number 2, we have a huge creature that can give you extra turns, and that's Emre Cool, the Aeon's Torn. Earlier, we talked about Part the Water Veil, which gives you a 4/4 haste that lets you take an extra turn for 9 mana. Know what's better than that? A 15 mana 15/15 with a huge block of text that also gives you an extra turn. Generally, this means that if you cast Emre Cool, you're going to win the game. Emre Cool is arguably the most powerful creature in the game if you merely look at what it can do once it is on the board. Your opponent has to brace themselves for 15 damage and give up 6 permanents before they get to have a turn again. In Standard, it featured in Eldrazi green decks, which had enough ramp that they could actually hardcast Emre Cool and get that extra turn. In Modern, it sees play in decks that try to cast it like various Tron and 12-post decks, but it also sees play in decks running through the Breach and instant speed reanimation spells. In those cases, you don't get your extra turn, but you get a huge, cheap creature who's going to devastate the board, so that's probably okay. In Legacy, it sees play in decks that cheated into play with Reanimation, Show and Tell, and Sneak Attack, but it also sees play in Omniscience decks where you do actually get to cast Emre Cool and get that extra turn. Emre Cool will continue to see play in both Legacy and Modern, but I highly doubt it ever catches the number 1 card on this list, which is, of course, the original Time Walk. obviously better in terms of raw power than anything on this list. Add an extra turn for 2 mana all the time. You don't have to do any sort of setup. Time Walk is one of the most iconic cards in Magic and part of the Power 9 for a reason. It's one of the most powerful cards ever. Almost every vintage deck there is runs the singleton copy of Time Walk that is allowed, and that means that Time Walk gets like 6 or more top 8s at every vintage championship event there is. While vintage events are not the most common, being locked in for a ton of points every event and every year is going to be enough to keep Time Walk at the top of this list for the foreseeable future. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure that you catch my future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to watch more of my Top 10s, you can see the playlist here on this screen. There are over 150 of them. Thanks for watching.